town where most people thought life was calm and peaceful. On the surface, everything seemed normal. People smiled at each other in stores, kids played in the parks, and neighbors greeted one another on the sidewalks. But beneath that calm, there were tensions that no one talked about openly. Some people held old, unfair beliefs, while others tried to ignore them, hoping they would go away. Angela had learned early in her life that the world was not always fair, and that people could be cruel without warning. But she also knew that she had to stand tall and face each day with courage, no matter what challenges came her way. On this particular afternoon, the sun was shining brightly, casting warm light over the streets lined with trees. Angela had just finished her shift at the local grocery store, where she worked long hours to save money for her dreams. She wanted to go to college one day and study social work so that she could help children and families in her community. As she left the store, she adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder and began walking home. Her mind wandered through thoughts of her future, of the plans she had made, and of the small joys of life, like seeing her friends over the weekend or visiting her grandmother. Angela liked to take the same route every day. It was familiar, safe, and allowed her to enjoy the quiet streets before the evening traffic began. She passed by houses with well-kept gardens, sidewalks where children sometimes left chalk drawings, and small shops that offered friendly greetings to anyone who walked in. She smiled at a man walking his dog, and the dog barked playfully as it ran toward her. Angela laughed softly and waved at the man, who tipped his hat in return. It was an ordinary day, or so she thought. Just a few blocks away, Robert was sitting on the porch of his house, watching the street with a sour expression. He was a man in his mid-40s, with a rigid posture and a constant frown that never seemed to leave his face. Robert had lived in this town for many years, and he had grown bitter over time. He often believed that the world owed him respect simply because he existed, and he had strong, old-fashioned views about who should and shouldn't belong in certain spaces. Many neighbors avoided him, but he had the habit of sitting outside in the afternoons, muttering to himself and keeping an eye on anyone who passed by. When Robert saw Angela walking past, he noticed the confidence in her stride and the way she held her head high. Something about that made him uncomfortable. He didn't know her, and he didn't care to, but he didn't like the way she seemed so free, so confident, so unafraid. A wave of anger rose in him, and he muttered something under his breath. It was the kind of anger that had been building inside him for years, a mixture of fear, ignorance, and stubborn pride. Angela, unaware of Robert's attention, continued on her path. She enjoyed listening to the sound of her shoes against the pavement and the faint rustle of the leaves in the trees. The neighborhood seemed peaceful, and for a moment, she allowed herself to relax. Life had its challenges, yes, but moments like this reminded her that there was still beauty in the world. She thought about stopping at the corner store to buy a snack for the walk home, but she decided to keep going. She liked the fresh air and the feeling of independence that came from walking alone. As she drew closer to Robert's house, she began to notice the tension in the air, although she didn't understand it yet. Robert's eyes were fixed on her, following her movements as she passed by. He felt a strange mix of anger and confusion. How could someone be so confident and calm when the world, in his mind, was full of people who did not belong? He shook his head slightly, as if trying to clear his thoughts, but the irritation only grew stronger. Angela didn't see him at first. She was thinking about her grandmother's advice: stand tall, Angela. Always walk with pride, because no one can take that away from you. Those words had guided her through many difficult situations in her life. She remembered the times at school when other kids had tried to intimidate her or make her feel small, and how she had learned to hold her head high, speak her mind, and never let fear control her. It wasn't always easy, but she knew that strength came from believing in herself and refusing to let others' negativity affect her. As she passed Robert's porch, he called out to her in a sharp, unfriendly tone. Angela paused and turned slightly, offering a cautious smile, thinking perhaps he wanted to ask for directions or needed help with something. But what she heard next made her stomach tighten. Robert's words were harsh and unkind, filled with old prejudices and assumptions that had no place in the modern world. Angela's heart beat faster, not out of fear of him, but because she had faced ignorance many times before and knew she had to respond carefully. She looked at him steadily, refusing to show weakness. Her mind raced through ways to handle the situation without escalating it, but she also knew she had a right to defend herself if things got worse. She remembered her mother's words, "Angela, always be brave, even when people try to make you feel small. Your dignity is yours, and no one can take it unless you let them." Robert's anger seemed to grow as he saw that she was not afraid. He had expected her to flinch, to look down, to show fear, but she stood tall and met his gaze. That simple act of confidence made him even more furious. He had lived his life thinking that people would submit to his threats and his words, and now someone had challenged that expectation. Angela continued walking, her pace steady, her mind focused on reaching home safely. But she couldn't ignore the tension building behind her. Robert stepped off his porch, his hands clenched at his sides, and began shouting more aggressively. Angela's first instinct was to remain calm and avoid confrontation, but the situation was escalating quickly. She knew she had to be alert, prepared to protect herself if necessary. Despite the rising tension, there was something remarkable about Angela in that moment. Even as someone tried to intimidate her, she remained composed, her thoughts clear, her heart steady. She had faced challenges before, both subtle and overt, and each time, she had learned to navigate the world with strength and courage. She had learned that fear could be controlled, that anger could be managed, and that dignity was a shield no one could pierce if she held it firmly. As Robert's shouts grew louder, neighbors began to notice the commotion. Some peeked through their windows, unsure of what was happening. Angela's presence in the middle of this unexpected confrontation highlighted a stark contrast between calm confidence and unchecked anger. She took a deep breath, her eyes scanning her surroundings, calculating the safest path forward, but also ready to stand her ground if the situation worsened. In that moment, the quiet suburban street became a stage where long-standing tensions were about to surface. Angela's story, her courage, and her unwavering sense of self were about to meet Robert's anger head-on. And although she did not know it yet, this encounter would change both of their lives and the lives of those around them in ways neither could have imagined. Angela had been walking carefully, her steps measured and steady, but she could sense that Robert's anger was growing. His voice, once a distant murmur, now rose in sharp, harsh tones. The words were filled with frustration, impatience, and old prejudices. He seemed determined to provoke a reaction, as if his own unhappiness could only be soothed by making someone else feel small. Angela could hear the change in his tone, the way it shifted from mere shouting to something heavier, more threatening. She knew this moment could turn dangerous if she wasn't careful. Angela's heart beat faster, not from fear but from the awareness that she needed to act wisely. Her mind raced through what she had been taught in countless situations where confrontation seemed unavoidable: stay calm, measure your words, and never let anger take control. She reminded herself that showing fear would not solve anything, but neither would letting anger guide her actions. She needed to remain clear-headed. Robert stepped closer, his posture aggressive, his hands raised slightly as if he were preparing to assert dominance. His eyes were fixed on Angela, trying to intimidate her, trying to force her to react. Angela, however, refused to take a step back. She had faced challenges before, people who had underestimated her, people who had thought they could scare her into submission. Each time, she had learned that strength wasn't about matching aggression with aggression, it was about standing firm, knowing her worth, and responding with intelligence and courage. "Hey, you think you can just walk by me like that?" Robert shouted, his voice echoing down the quiet street. Angela didn't flinch. She slowed her pace slightly and looked directly at him, her gaze calm but firm. "I'm just walking home," she said evenly, her voice steady despite the tension. There was no hesitation in her tone, no sign of fear. It was a small reply, but it carried the weight of someone who refused to be intimidated. Robert's face twisted with disbelief and anger. He had expected a reaction: anger, fear, submission, but Angela's calm defiance was not what he had anticipated. The anger that had been simmering inside him for years now boiled to the surface. Without thinking clearly, he took a step forward and reached out to strike her. It was a sudden, shocking motion, the kind of impulsive act that comes from uncontrolled emotion. Angela barely had time to register what was happening. Her instincts kicked in immediately. Years of navigating difficult situations had taught her to protect herself when necessary. She moved quickly, stepping aside and raising her hands in a defensive position. The moment passed in a blur, but Angela's mind remained focused. She knew that this confrontation was no longer just words, it had become physical. She also knew that she couldn't allow herself to be harmed or humiliated. Robert, shocked that she didn't collapse or retreat, froze for a brief moment. Angela could see the confusion on his face. He had expected her to flinch, to look away, to show fear, but instead, she was steady and alert. That moment of hesitation gave Angela an opening. She spoke again, her voice clear and unwavering. "Violence isn't the answer," she said. "Walk away before this gets worse." Her words were firm but not aggressive. They carried the strength of someone who knew her rights, someone who would not allow another person's anger to control her. For a brief second, it seemed that Robert might reconsider. He hesitated, as if weighing the situation, trying to decide if he could regain control. But his pride and long-held bitterness would not let him step back. The anger inside him had grown too strong, and he lashed out again. Angela's movements were swift and precise, a combination of instinct and self-defense. She blocked his attempt to strike her and used his momentum to create distance. It wasn't about hurting him, it was about protecting herself. Each motion was careful, calculated, and necessary. The onlookers who had begun to gather at nearby windows gasped quietly, witnessing a confrontation that they had hoped would never happen in their peaceful neighborhood. Angela's mind remained focused on safety. She scanned the street, noting the positions of people and obstacles, thinking about the fastest route to reach a safe space if the situation escalated. She remembered her training in self-protection, simple lessons her mother and community center had taught her: keep your balance, use your strength wisely, and always remain aware of your surroundings. Every move she made was deliberate, controlled, and confident. Robert's anger, however, had taken over his reasoning. He did not stop to consider the consequences of his actions. He advanced again, shouting insults and threats, convinced that his aggression would force compliance. Angela, standing her ground, responded with a mixture of calm words and defensive actions. She spoke loudly enough for the neighbors to hear, warning him to stop before things got out of control. Her voice was strong, carrying the weight of authority without needing to yell. The crowd watching from their windows and doorways grew larger, their curiosity piqued by the unusual confrontation. Some whispered to each other, unsure of how to react. Others reached for their phones, ready to call for help if necessary. Angela, aware of the audience but not distracted by it, focused entirely on keeping herself safe and diffusing the situation if possible. She understood that attention could sometimes escalate aggression, but it could also serve as a deterrent if she used it wisely. Robert, frustrated by his inability to intimidate her, made a reckless move. Angela saw it coming and moved aside, narrowly avoiding being struck. The sound of the impact against the ground where she had been standing echoed through the quiet street. That sound, more than anything, seemed to shock Robert himself. He had expected her to react differently, and her calm resilience had thrown him off balance. Angela used that moment to step back further, putting safe distance between herself and him while maintaining a posture that showed she was not afraid. Neighbors began emerging from their homes, calling out for Robert to stop and telling him that what he was doing was unacceptable. The intervention of witnesses added pressure, and for the first time, Robert seemed aware that his actions were being seen by others who would not tolerate them. Angela, noticing this shift, continued to speak in calm, assertive tones. She made it clear that she would not allow herself to be harmed and that the situation needed to end peacefully. Even as the confrontation unfolded, Angela's thoughts were sharp and deliberate. She knew that if help arrived quickly, she could resolve the situation without further risk. She kept herself steady, breathing deeply to maintain control, and carefully monitored Robert's movements. She was determined not to let fear or anger cloud her judgment. Her courage and preparation became her shield, allowing her to face a dangerous moment with composure and strength. Robert's shock grew as he realized that his plan to intimidate her had failed completely. Angela had not only refused to show fear but had also demonstrated that she could defend herself. This realization began to crack the wall of his confidence. He had expected an easy target, someone who would submit to his aggression without question. Angela's defiance was something he had not anticipated, and it left him momentarily unsure of what to do next. The situation continued for a few more tense moments, with Angela carefully maintaining distance while communicating clearly that violence was not acceptable. Her words, combined with her controlled movements, made it clear to both Robert and the watching neighbors that she was strong, aware, and ready to protect herself. It was a turning point in the confrontation, a moment where courage, preparation, and composure could change the course of events. By the time the first calls to the authorities were being made, Angela had positioned herself near a safer part of the street, ensuring she had an escape route if necessary. Robert, still fueled by frustration but beginning to feel the weight of his actions, finally hesitated. His aggression had reached a point where it could no longer continue without consequences, and Angela's calm determination was a stark reminder that he could not control her. This confrontation, which had begun as a sudden escalation of anger, was now evolving into a moment of clarity for both individuals. Angela's courage and intelligence were on full display, demonstrating that self-respect, calm thinking, and preparedness could stand up to aggression and intimidation. Robert, confronted with someone who refused to be overpowered, was forced to face the consequences of his unchecked anger. Even as the tension slowly began to subside, the lesson of the encounter was clear: courage and self-control could transform a dangerous situation, and no one had the right to diminish another person's dignity. Angela's unwavering stance had not only protected her physically but had also set a powerful example for anyone witnessing the scene. Angela stood her ground, her breathing steady, her mind focused on what to do next. She had faced Robert's anger and aggression and had managed to protect herself without letting fear take over. Yet she knew the confrontation was not completely over. Robert's eyes were still full of frustration and disbelief. He could not understand how his actions had failed to intimidate her. To him, the situation had been simple: he would shout, threaten, and perhaps even strike, and Angela would back down. But she hadn't, and that realization seemed to shake him in a way he had not experienced before. The neighbors had begun to gather more openly now. People stepped onto their porches, children peeked from windows, and some brave adults walked closer to the street to observe. Many were talking quietly among themselves, commenting on how unusual it was to see such a bold confrontation. Angela noticed the crowd, but she refused to let it distract her. Her attention remained fixed on Robert, on keeping herself safe, and on handling the situation wisely. Robert took another step toward her, his hand slightly raised, as if he were trying to assert authority again. But this time, he moved more cautiously. He realized that Angela's movements were deliberate and controlled. Every step she took was calculated to protect herself, and her calm voice reminded him that this was not a situation where she could be easily frightened. Angela had transformed what could have been a moment of helplessness into one of clear control. "You don't have to do this," Angela said, her voice strong and steady, but not harsh. "Walk away, and no one gets hurt. You're only making this worse for yourself." There was something in her tone, a mix of firmness, intelligence, and care that seemed to reach even Robert's anger. For a moment, he paused, considering her words. He was not used to being challenged with logic and calm courage. Usually, fear or submission was the only response he encountered, and he found that unsettling. Despite this moment of hesitation, Robert's pride would not allow him to back down completely. He took another step forward, this time trying to provoke her again. Angela, prepared for his move, shifted slightly to the side, keeping a safe distance. Her actions were precise, she was not reacting with anger but with careful calculation. She remembered the advice her mother and teachers had given her about staying composed in dangerous situations: always maintain distance, use your body wisely, and never let fear make you rush. The crowd began murmuring softly. People exchanged glances, some impressed by Angela's courage, others concerned about how the situation might escalate. A few neighbors discreetly reached for their phones, ready to call for help if necessary. Angela noticed these movements but kept her focus on Robert. She understood that attention could be both a help and a danger. It could discourage him from acting violently, but it could also escalate his anger if he felt humiliated in front of others. Robert, frustrated by the lack of fear in Angela, suddenly lunged forward, attempting to grab her. Angela reacted instantly, sidestepping his movement and using his momentum to create further distance between them. She was careful not to harm him, her goal was protection, not retaliation. Each of her actions was guided by instinct and awareness, honed from experiences where she had to defend herself in smaller conflicts before. Her control over the situation amazed even some of the neighbors who watched quietly from their windows. Angela's voice rang out again. "Stop this. You don't want trouble, and I don't either. Let's end this now before it gets worse." Her tone carried authority without aggression. It was clear that she had the upper hand, not because of violence, but because of courage, presence of mind, and refusal to be intimidated. Even in the face of someone larger and seemingly stronger, her composure made it evident that she could handle herself. Robert stumbled slightly, caught off guard by her steady resistance. His anger was still there, but confusion and shock had begun to mix with it. He had never faced someone who could respond so calmly, who refused to let his aggression dominate the situation. It was a new experience for him, and it left him momentarily vulnerable. Angela recognized this and kept her focus, ensuring she maintained distance while preparing for any further attempts to escalate. Neighbors, sensing the intensity of the moment, started speaking louder. "Hey, stop it," someone called from a nearby porch. "This is not right." Their voices, supportive of Angela, seemed to strengthen her position. She could feel the subtle shift in energy as people began to side with her presence and courage. Even Robert noticed that he was no longer alone in the street, the community was observing, and that awareness seemed to add weight to Angela's words. Angela continued moving carefully, staying alert and maintaining a safe space between herself and Robert. Her mind worked quickly, planning her next steps. She thought about reaching a location where she could get immediate help if necessary, like a nearby store or a neighbor's house. She considered the best route to ensure her safety while still demonstrating calm strength. Each movement was intentional, designed to avoid harm while maintaining authority over the situation. Robert, frustrated and bewildered, made another attempt to intimidate her. He shouted, his voice full of anger and disbelief, but Angela refused to show fear. She stood tall, her gaze steady, her voice firm, and her body ready to react only in defense. She had learned through experience that fear could weaken a person, but courage and calmness could empower them even in dangerous situations. The confrontation had reached a critical point. Angela's courage was no longer just about defending herself, it was about sending a clear message. She would not tolerate aggression, she would not be intimidated, and she would not allow someone else's anger to control her. This was not just a personal stand, it was a display of strength, dignity, and the power of maintaining composure under pressure. Robert, realizing that his attempts to frighten her were failing, finally paused again. He seemed to struggle with the idea that someone could stand up to him with such calmness and intelligence. His anger remained, but it was now mixed with frustration and uncertainty. Angela saw that moment as an opportunity to continue de-escalating the situation. She spoke clearly, making her intentions known without aggression. "This ends here. Walk away, and no one has to get hurt. I will not fight you, but I will protect myself if you continue." The words seemed to resonate not only with Robert but with the neighbors who had gathered to watch. The presence of witnesses, combined with Angela's calm strength, began to shift the dynamics. The street, once tense and threatening, started to feel less dangerous. People moved closer, showing support, and their presence added a layer of accountability that made it harder for Robert to continue his aggressive behavior. Angela's awareness of her surroundings remained sharp. She noticed potential exits, safe spaces, and the positions of neighbors who could intervene if needed. Her focus was on safety and de-escalation. She did not seek revenge or to escalate the conflict, she wanted to resolve it with dignity. Every action, every word, was carefully chosen to protect herself while discouraging further aggression. Robert's anger, however, was deeply ingrained. It took time for him to recognize that his usual methods of intimidation were ineffective. Angela's calm confidence, her readiness to defend herself without aggression, and her refusal to be afraid were new experiences for him. He had spent years thinking he could control situations through force or fear, but Angela's response challenged that entire mindset. The tension remained high, but Angela's presence continued to assert control. Her courage inspired the onlookers, who now whispered words of encouragement and quietly offered support. Children peeked through windows, seeing an example of strength and dignity. Adults, too, recognized the importance of what was happening. This was not just a personal confrontation but a lesson in courage, composure, and standing up for oneself. Angela maintained her calm, measured tone, addressing Robert without aggression. "You don't need to do this. You can choose to end it now." Her words were steady, confident, and non-confrontational. She had learned that sometimes, the most powerful form of defense is calm reasoning combined with assertive presence. Robert, sensing the shift, finally took a hesitant step back. He was not completely defeated, but he realized that his usual tactics were ineffective. Angela had proven that courage, intelligence, and composure could neutralize aggression. For the first time in the confrontation, Robert was forced to reconsider his actions. At that moment, Angela's mind reflected briefly on everything that had brought her here, the lessons from her family, the experiences that had taught her resilience, and the moments in life where she had learned to stand up for herself. She understood that courage was not the absence of fear but the ability to act despite it. She had faced danger, remained composed, and protected herself with dignity and intelligence. The crowd, sensing the shift, began to relax. Their whispered encouragement turned into quiet praise. Angela's courage had not only protected her but had also inspired those around her. It was a powerful reminder that strength comes in many forms, and that calm confidence can often triumph over aggression. Angela's eyes never left Robert as he finally stepped back, though only slightly. The tension in the air was still thick, but she could sense that the situation was slowly reaching a turning point. He was breathing heavily, his face red with frustration and disbelief. Every instinct in him told him to regain control, to intimidate her, but her unwavering calm and presence of mind made that impossible. For the first time, he realized that this was not a simple confrontation where fear could make her comply. Angela's mind remained sharp. She knew she needed to maintain this control without escalating the situation further. Violence had not been her goal, and she did not want to provoke it. She had managed to protect herself so far, but the final steps were just as important. Every movement, every word, mattered now. She adjusted her stance, keeping her feet planted firmly on the ground, ready to respond if necessary, but not acting out of anger. The neighbors had become more involved. A few had stepped closer, showing their support quietly but clearly. Some children peered curiously from behind curtains, sensing the drama unfolding outside. Adults whispered to each other, some nodding at Angela's courage, others shaking their heads at Robert's behavior. The presence of the community added weight to the situation. It was no longer a private confrontation, it was a public statement of courage versus unchecked aggression. Robert, however, was still struggling with his emotions. His pride and long-held sense of authority had been challenged, and he did not know how to react. Angela's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with his anger, creating a powerful imbalance. He tried to regain his dominance, raising his voice again, but his words lacked the certainty they had before. He was visibly shaken, though he refused to show full submission. Angela took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew that words could be just as powerful as physical actions. She spoke clearly, loudly enough for the neighbors and even Robert himself to hear, "This does not have to end badly. You can walk away now, and nothing more will happen. Choose that path." There was no trace of fear in her tone. Instead, it carried strength, clarity, and wisdom beyond her years. Her words, simple as they were, struck a chord. The calmness, the lack of aggression, and the insistence on reason disrupted Robert's cycle of anger. He had expected confrontation, chaos, and submission, but Angela offered none of those things. She offered strength, courage, and intelligence. For a moment, he froze, trying to comprehend why his usual tactics were failing. Angela remained alert, her body ready to respond if necessary. She kept a safe distance, ensuring that Robert could not lunge at her again without notice. She shifted slightly, subtly positioning herself closer to the middle of the street, which gave her options to move in any direction if he tried to escalate further. Her attention to detail, learned from years of navigating difficult situations, gave her an advantage in this tense moment. The community's presence grew more apparent. A few neighbors spoke up, urging Robert to stop. "This is not acceptable," one said firmly. "Step back now." Their words, combined with Angela's calm commands, created a united front against aggression. The power of witnesses, standing in quiet support, made it even harder for Robert to act recklessly without consequences. Angela noticed this and continued to maintain her position confidently. Robert's frustration reached a new peak. He had tried intimidation, shouting, and even attempting a physical threat, but nothing had worked. Angela's composure and courage had consistently deflected his aggression, and now the weight of community observation pressed on him. He realized that if he continued, he would face consequences that went beyond this confrontation. He could be held accountable by law and by neighbors who had seen everything. Angela saw an opportunity. Her voice, calm but firm, carried a tone of finality. "This is your chance to end it peacefully. Walk away. Nothing else needs to happen. But if you continue, you will face the results of your actions." Her words were not a threat, they were a clear statement of responsibility. She had not raised her hands aggressively, she had not shouted insults, and she had not sought revenge. She had simply stood her ground, defended herself, and asked for reason. Robert hesitated. The reality of the situation began to settle in. He had misjudged Angela, misjudged the situation, and now faced the undeniable truth that he could not control her. Every attempt he made to dominate or intimidate her had failed. His anger and pride were clashing with the reality of his own powerlessness in the face of her courage. For the first time in the confrontation, he realized he was outmatched not by strength, but by composure, intelligence, and determination. Angela maintained eye contact, unwavering, as she waited. She did not provoke further, did not insult or mock him. Her strength lay in restraint and clarity. She allowed him the chance to step back, to reclaim some dignity by making the right choice. The tension in the street was palpable. Neighbors watched silently, sensing that this moment was crucial. The confrontation could still escalate if Robert acted impulsively, but Angela's courage had shifted the balance. Minutes passed, though it felt longer. Robert's movements slowed. He took a small step backward, then another. Angela did not advance, she simply held her position, showing readiness without aggression. The quiet strength in her posture and voice communicated that she would not be intimidated further, but also that the conflict could end peacefully if he chose. The community's quiet support reinforced her position. Neighbors stepped a bit closer, giving subtle signals that they would not tolerate violence. Children watched, learning that courage, dignity, and calmness could overcome aggression. The presence of witnesses created a natural pressure, making it harder for Robert to act without consequences. Angela understood this dynamic and used it wisely. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Robert stopped advancing. His shoulders slumped slightly, and he muttered under his breath, retreating to the porch he had stood on earlier. He was still frustrated and angry, but the confrontation had shifted decisively. Angela had not only protected herself, but she had also demonstrated control over the situation, resilience, and courage that neither words nor aggression could undermine. Angela took a moment to breathe, still standing tall. She felt a mix of relief and clarity. Relief because the immediate danger had passed, and clarity because she understood the power of composure, courage, and intelligence in a high-stress situation. She had faced someone determined to intimidate her and had emerged with dignity intact. Her self-respect remained untouched, and she had shown everyone present that aggression cannot overcome calm courage. The crowd of neighbors slowly began to disperse, though many stayed to offer words of encouragement and support. "You were amazing," one woman said quietly. "I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that with so much control." Children smiled at Angela, inspired by her strength. Even some of the adults, who had been silent witnesses, nodded in respect. Angela's courage had not only protected herself but had also left a lasting impression on those around her. Angela's thoughts turned briefly to the lessons she had learned. Courage is not about fighting back with anger or violence, it is about standing firm, thinking clearly, and defending yourself without losing dignity. Strength is not measured by size or aggression, but by composure, intelligence, and the ability to act wisely in difficult situations. She reflected on how her family, community, and past experiences had prepared her for this moment. Each lesson, each challenge, had built the resilience that allowed her to face Robert without fear. Even Robert, standing on his porch, could not ignore the truth. His attempts to intimidate had failed, and he was confronted with someone who refused to be cowed by anger or aggression. Angela had not only protected herself physically but had also demonstrated the power of courage and composure in the face of hostility. He had been shocked, humbled, and forced to recognize that his actions were unacceptable. Angela finally turned and continued her walk home, her pace calm, her mind reflective. She had faced a dangerous and uncomfortable situation, and she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more confident. The street, once tense with anger, had returned to its quiet, suburban calm, but the lesson of the confrontation lingered. Courage, dignity, and clarity had triumphed over aggression and fear. Angela walked the rest of the way home, her steps slow and thoughtful. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and pink, but her mind was still alive with the events of the afternoon. The confrontation with Robert had been intense, frightening at times, but she had remained calm and strong. Now, as she reflected on what had happened, she realized that it was more than just a personal encounter, it was a lesson in courage, resilience, and dignity. Her thoughts drifted to her family, who had always taught her the importance of standing up for herself while remaining respectful. Her mother's words echoed clearly in her mind, "Angela, courage isn't about fighting with anger, it's about knowing your worth and protecting it wisely." She had lived by these words all her life, and today, they had guided her through a very real and difficult situation. Angela felt a deep sense of pride, not arrogance, but the pride that comes from knowing she had acted with integrity and intelligence under pressure. As she passed familiar houses and small shops, Angela noticed neighbors looking at her differently. Some waved quietly, offering smiles of approval. Others nodded in respect, perhaps realizing the courage it took to stand firm in the face of aggression. She had always been part of this community, but today, she had become a symbol of resilience. Her actions had reminded people that dignity, courage, and calm thinking could overcome fear and intimidation. Angela's thoughts then turned to Robert. She did not feel hatred or desire for revenge. Instead, she felt a quiet hope that he might reflect on his behavior and learn from the experience. His anger had been fueled by ignorance and long-held prejudices, but Angela understood that change was possible. She knew that his shock at her courage might be the beginning of self-reflection, and perhaps, in time, he would reconsider how he treated others. Angela realized that standing up for herself could also have a broader impact, teaching even those who seemed unwilling to change that their actions had consequences. As she walked, Angela thought about the importance of community. The neighbors who had quietly supported her had played a vital role, even if they had not directly intervened. Their presence had reminded her that courage is not only personal but also collective. When people witness strength and integrity, it inspires them to reflect on their own actions and values. Angela felt grateful for the quiet support, the acknowledgement that she was not alone, and that others were willing to stand against wrongdoing in small but meaningful ways. Reaching her home, Angela paused at the gate and looked back down the street. The place where the confrontation had occurred seemed calmer now, almost ordinary, but she knew the events of that afternoon would not be forgotten by those who had witnessed them. She remembered the subtle shifts in Robert's posture, the brief hesitation in his steps, and the recognition in his eyes that he could not control her. Angela understood that her courage had made a lasting impression not through violence or anger, but through calm strength and presence of mind. Angela entered her home and took a deep breath, feeling the tension of the day slowly melting away. She reflected on how the experience had strengthened her confidence. She had faced aggression and intimidation, yet she had maintained control over her emotions, her actions, and her dignity. She realized that courage is a skill that grows through practice, preparation, and experience, and that today's confrontation had tested her in ways that would shape her future. Sitting down in her favorite chair, Angela thought about the lessons she could share with others. She realized that standing up for oneself is not just about physical safety, it is about protecting one's values, self-respect, and sense of justice. Courage is not the absence of fear, she reminded herself, but the ability to act wisely despite fear. She understood that intelligence, awareness, and calm thinking were as important as strength when confronting aggression or injustice. Angela also reflected on the role of empathy and understanding. She did not wish harm on Robert, and she hoped that he would learn from the experience. She knew that anger and prejudice often stemmed from fear, ignorance, or unexamined beliefs. By responding with calm courage instead of retaliation, she had given him a chance to see a different way of interacting with the world. In a quiet way, she realized that her actions had the potential to inspire change not only in herself and her community but even in someone who had sought to harm her. Her thoughts then turned to her friends and family, who would want to know what had happened. Angela felt a sense of responsibility to share the story accurately, emphasizing the lessons rather than the conflict. She wanted others to see that courage does not mean confrontation for its own sake, and that strength is not measured by aggression but by composure, clarity, and moral integrity. Her experience had become more than a personal victory, it was a story with lessons that could guide and inspire others. As she prepared for dinner, Angela reflected on how this experience might influence her future. She realized that challenges and conflicts would continue to arise in life, and that today's lessons would help her face them with wisdom and courage. She thought about her goal of helping others, especially children and families in her community, and recognized that experiences like today's would make her a stronger advocate for fairness, respect, and understanding. Her courage had not only protected herself but had also strengthened her resolve to make a positive difference in the world. Later that evening, as Angela sat by the window watching the last light fade from the sky, she felt a quiet sense of peace. The confrontation with Robert had tested her in unexpected ways, but it had also affirmed her belief in the power of courage, composure, and dignity. She knew that fear could not control her, and that standing firm in her values could inspire others to do the same. She reflected on the importance of self-respect, the lessons of her upbringing, and the quiet strength of her community, all of which had played a part in guiding her through the afternoon's events. Angela's thoughts also returned to the larger meaning of the day. She realized that standing up for oneself is about more than a single encounter. It is about the choices we make in moments of challenge, the way we respond to aggression or injustice, and the example we set for others. Courage, she understood, is contagious. By facing aggression with calm strength, she had shown her neighbors, her friends, and even her community that fear does not have to dictate actions, and that dignity can prevail even in difficult circumstances. Before going to bed, Angela made a mental note of the lessons she had learned, that courage is measured by how you handle difficult situations, that composure can disarm aggression, that self-respect is non-negotiable, and that one's actions can inspire others. She felt a renewed sense of purpose. The confrontation with Robert, though challenging, had strengthened her resolve to live by her values, to protect herself, and to inspire positive change wherever she could. Angela finally lay down to sleep, feeling a sense of accomplishment and quiet pride. She had faced a difficult moment, protected herself with wisdom and courage, and emerged stronger. She knew that life would continue to bring challenges, but she was confident that the lessons she had learned would guide her in the future. Standing up for oneself, she realized, is never easy, but it is always worth it when done with integrity and clarity. In the days that followed, the community began to reflect on what had happened. Neighbors discussed the courage Angela had shown, recognizing that it was an example of strength, intelligence, and dignity. Some who had previously been silent about injustice found inspiration in her actions. Children spoke to their parents about how Angela had stood her ground, and adults quietly admired the way she had maintained composure under pressure. Her actions had sparked a conversation about courage, respect, and the importance of standing up for what is right. Angela, too, reflected on the broader significance of her experience. She realized that courage is not about confrontation for its own sake, but about protecting oneself and upholding one's values. Strength is not about overpowering others, but about maintaining clarity, composure, and dignity. By standing firm in the face of aggression, she had not only safeguarded herself but had also shown her community the power of resilience, integrity, and courage. Through the experience, Angela understood that each act of courage has ripple effects. By choosing to act wisely, calmly, and firmly, she had influenced not only her own life but also the attitudes of those around her. Her bravery, intelligence, and self-respect had left a lasting impression, reminding everyone that courage and dignity can prevail even in the most difficult circumstances. Angela's story, though personal, became a source of inspiration. It reminded people that standing up for oneself is not about fighting with anger, but about facing challenges with courage, awareness, and clarity. It highlighted the power of composure in the face of aggression, and the importance of maintaining dignity and self-respect, even when confronted with hostility. Through her actions, Angela had demonstrated that true courage is measured by wisdom, resilience, and the ability to inspire others through example.